This is the talk of Senior Lecturer and Tertiary Education Union President Sandra Gray at the Digital Power and Social Control public meeting held in Wellington, New Zealand on Tuesday, May the 12th, 2015.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Val. And I'm both a political scientist and a trade union activist. And I guess central to much of the work I do, or all of the work I do, is the idea of citizen voice and how we as citizens have more of a voice in the world that we live in. So it probably picks up actually where you left off, is what do we do about these things? I mean, one of the things we do, and I want to congratulate Val and all the organisers of this meeting, is that actually we have to have more citizens getting together, more forums, more discussions. We have to ask questions. We have to ask the hard questions of ourselves, our, fellow citizens, of our political leaders and the elite. We need to hold them to account, and we have to be vigilant, always. I think the big data era, I agree, we can't actually stop it. It's an era where the storage, collection and processing of mass data sets is a reality right now. But the thing is, what do we have to do now? Well, we have to actively debate how far we want it to go. What do we want to do? The debate has to be open. But from a social scientist perspective, actually there are some good things for me about having big data sets, unfortunately. And that's the hard position you're in when you're defending the right of academics to engage in public debate. It's really hard to argue against capitalism unless you have big data to show the ills of capitalism. So there are tools that we use that actually involve us trying to fight a system we disagree with, using the very tools that we think are problematic for the citizens inside. But what we have to do is protect our rights to say how data should be collected, stored and used. I know that you're going to get conversations about integrated data sets, but I guess for me the thing is that increasingly the government's adding more and more data sets into what Stats New Zealand can collate together. From a democratic perspective, from a citizen's perspective, from an activist perspective, we need to question how protected we're going to be, but also what are they using it for? Big data can be used to tell us some broad trends about the world we live in. There's no doubt that that can be done. And the government continually talks about evidence-based policy. I must say they don't actually do evidence-based policy, but that's the reason they say they need data, is for evidence-based policy. But actually you can't decide what destination you want to reach by using data. You actually have to debate the destination as citizens, including what place does data collection have in that destination? What type of society do we want to be? Is not a question that you can run data over. I think the thing about big data for me is that, the powerful political and social elite, the men in suits who run this world, will at times, and do already at times, use data to push their own ends, and that's what we have to push back against as activists, as social scientists, as citizens. The best counter to that is actually that we engage, not that we opt out. And this is difficult in an age where people do become very wary of engaging, particularly engaging online, which is where a lot of left-wing activism now has headed. And people are wary about being online. And I'm not saying we should put everything up online, but I am saying there is a space for activists in using online tools and using online spaces. But our main power is our ability to actually stand shoulder to shoulder and challenge those in Parliament, those in business, and any space using our power, which is actually just collective power. We have to make sure we stand together to combat big business, big state. We need big citizenry, and we don't have that at the moment. We don't have an active and engaged citizenry. Part of that is actually we have to understand a bit more on this debate. We have to get the public understanding a bit more about what data is, how it's used, what it means, but also to accurately understand what the state already does, to understand what the Statistics Act says, what is already collected. Unfortunately for all of us, we live in a punitive state and society. There is no doubt that we live in a surveillance state. And unfortunately, we are very determined as a state and society to determine individual fault for each occasion, and big data can be used to actually do that. Big data can be used to individualise fault and make an individual responsible rather than looking at the systemic causes, the structural problems. And that's a world I don't want to see us going down, and that's where checks and balances have to come in. Currently, the Statistics Act in and of itself, so the very biggest of data sets is held with Statistics New Zealand, they have the most integrated set, says that the sole use for data is to be for bona fide research or statistical purposes in relation to matters of public interest. Well, whose interest do we really mean when we say public interest? And that's a question we actually have to have some control over. What is the public interest? If they are going to collect these data sets in the public interest and in relation to matters of the public interest, what do we mean? What do we mean by that term? There is always a risk that someone's going to overstep the boundaries and act unethically, despite what all of the legislation says. And I think, we have to have a clear decision from us all. What happens if a public servant, an academic, a social scientist or a politician doesn't follow the clear directive saying what you can and can't use data for? You're not allowed to use it to punish people right now. The law makes it clear. What happens if you overstep the bounds? Why wasn't Paula Bennett immediately stood down as the Minister of Social Development when she released details of 2 women on the tertiary incentive allowance? Why wasn't she immediately stood down? She shouldn't be a minister because she broke a really fundamental rule about those women's information. We must hold people to account. If academics break the rules, they can't justify having their jobs or access to data. If politicians and public servants do it. But we also need to then debate more about what data does to us. Data isn't neutral. The collection of data is not neutral. It is politically motivated. It is used politically. It's used for someone to gain power, and we do have to talk about that power. And as I say, beyond the individual abuses, whose power is data being collected for? Even the process of being involved in data collection can make you, or being involved as a participant in data collection can alter your behaviour. We were, as a household, my partner Adam and I were part of the SOPHI study run by Statistics New Zealand. And this was a longitudinal study. They came every year for 7 years to ask us some fundamental questions about our household, our income, what we did, what we were studying. They asked some very personal questions about health some years for an integrated health data set. And every year, just before the Statistics New Zealand person arrived, I'd go, what have we done? How have we improved? What new thing have we bought? And I used to watch in amazement as the statistics collector would look at us, because what statistics do is create a version of what is normal. What does a normal adult in New Zealand society look like? What does a normal person look like? And they'd ask us questions like, how many televisions do you own? And I'd always say, well, we have one. And they'd look at us and go, only one. Yep, last time I checked. Do you have a dryer? No, we don't have a clothes dryer. You don't? Not the last time I looked. So the assumption was we were somehow outside the norm. And that's one of the things that big data does. It tells us what a normal human being looks like. We have to be aware that that is happening to us and all of the people around us. I spend a lot of my time talking about the role of academics, of being the critic and conscience of society. And one of the things we need as the critic and conscience of society is we need academic freedom. We need the freedom to speak unpopular truths. And I actually, I was reflecting on this because I thought there will be some at the meeting that won't agree with me that there's any way that big data could be good. But I have to speak what I know we use it for and what I believe is actually what the evidence is showing, because that's my job. But to do this, to have academic freedom, my institution, Victoria University, has to have responsible autonomy. They cannot be beholden to any organisation, to the state, to business, to any social or economic elite. They have to be accountable to the publics of New Zealand. And certainly if they're going to get access to big data, which they are increasingly getting access to, academics need to be able to use it with the public interest in mind, not be driven by governments and their demands. And it probably is an area we disagree a little bit. I actually think the other thing we need to do is we need to strengthen the public service, actually, to turn them away from being technocrats, blindly following the will of government, finding data that backs up the government's view, actually back to being public servants who are there to serve the public interest. Give them some responsibility some control.
Advice.
Yeah, able to give frank and fearless advice to ministers because they can't do it at the moment. So, counting affects us, the citizens inside. You know, it affects how we believe things should be valued. We only count and measure things in New Zealand that we think are valued, money being the biggest thing we count and value. And Marilyn Waring certainly showed that in her very landmark work around women's work. Counting for nothing describes it exactly. All the work women does not earn money, therefore it is of no value. That's another effect of big data. It tells us what we should value as a society, when in fact we should have that debate as citizens. What do we value? What do we think is important? We shouldn't be driven by big data into determining the future. I must say, you know, finally, in regards to state power and the state collection of data, we actually can make some noise and we can tell them what we want, and we should, and we must. We may not be able to stop all of the ill effects, but we have to be vigilant and we have to get more citizens on board this. But the other thing I think we have to do is we have to charge our state and make sure that they actually start to safeguard citizens, genuinely safeguard citizens against the power of multinational corporations and domestic companies, because that's an area where our state can have some control no matter what they say. We are a sovereign state. We should be able to say what companies do in New Zealand and those companies trading in New Zealand, and the misuse of data by companies is something we should take seriously. So, you know, it's a mixed bag with mixed data for me, because with big data for me, because as I say, for me, there are some things I couldn't argue. I couldn't argue against inequality if I didn't have big data, unfortunately. I'm actually a qualitative social scientist, so, you know, the big data I use is also backed up by real-world experiences, and that's important. But, you know, in the world we live in today, we may need some big data to actually advance what we see as the right society, but inside that we have to be aware as citizens what data means, how it's used, and what it actually does to us as individuals and as a collective.